You have 30 seconds to tell me why I should not put a bullet through your shoulder.
Tell me about the missing shipment from the docks.
You have 30 seconds to tell me why I should not put a bullet through your shoulder for the missing shipment from the docks. The cold edge of my voice cut through the private study with the familiar weight of absolute authority. Across the heavy mahogany desk, one of my most trusted capos paled visibly, his breathing shallow and erratic as his eyes darted toward the window. In my world, power was measured strictly by fear, and nobody ever dared to question my decisions, challenge my authority, or risk embarrassing me in front of my enforcers. I was the Korean Mafia boss who controlled an ironclad empire stretching across the entire city, accustomed to men lowering their eyes the moment I stepped into a room. Yet, the true disruption to my carefully maintained life was sitting just downstairs, entirely untouched by the terror I commanded, Rose. She was my plus-size maid, the quiet and unassuming woman who had worked in my household long before an unexpected political alliance turned her into my wife. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't intimidating, and she certainly didn't look like the kind of woman who could command a criminal organization. But she could cook, and that single domestic comfort had just become the catalyst for the most humiliating mistake of my entire life. Only an hour earlier, after a brutal, draining meeting that left my men tense and exhausted, I had walked back into the main quarters and found Rose proudly serving a massive, steaming homemade dinner. Instead of appreciating the genuine effort, I had looked straight at her hopeful expression, laughed out loud, and mocked her cooking right in front of my elite guards. I told her bluntly that running a kitchen was the only thing she was ever good for, and jokingly asked whether she thought she was some kind of Mama Rose. She didn't argue back, snap with anger, or demand an apology for the public humiliation. She simply smiled quietly, placed her utensils down, and walked away into the shadows of the mansion without a word. I thought that was the end of it, just a casual reminder of our respective places in this syndicate. But let me start from the beginning, before the blood, before the rings, and before I realized who my wife truly was. When Rose first stepped through the towering iron gates of the Bellini estate, she carried only 2 suitcases. One held her modest collection of clothes, while the second contained dozens of weathered notebooks tied carefully with faded blue ribbons. Inside those leather-bound pages lived generations of family recipes, every single one covered with handwritten notes and margins written by her late grandfather. He had taught her a fundamental rule that shaped her entire existence: never cook to impress people, but cook so they feel remembered. Long before she ever learned sophisticated culinary techniques, Rose understood that food was another language, one that communicated directly to people that they mattered. She simply never imagined entering a family or a household where no one seemed even remotely interested in hearing that language spoken. Our marriage had begun strictly as a cold political alliance designed to bring stability to both families, rather than any kind of romance. When she arrived, I welcomed her respectfully after the ceremony, explaining in a calm tone that I hoped she would be comfortable, but I never actually invited her into my dangerous world. Almost immediately, Vivian Morty, my elegant aunt who had managed the Bellini estate for nearly 20 years, stepped in to establish absolute control over every domestic detail. Vivian welcomed Rose with flawless manners that stopped just short of actual kindness, ensuring she was kept entirely away from the main kitchens and household responsibilities. While Vivian and other staff members dismissed Rose with polite indifference or whispered rumors about her size and lack of official duties, Rose quietly chose a different path. She learned every single employee's name, asked the estate gardeners about their children, remembered birthdays, and even helped elderly housekeepers carry heavy laundry baskets despite their protests. Even I unintentionally reinforced that emotional distance. One evening, when I found her sitting quietly reading recipes in the library, I expressed genuine surprise that she still enjoyed cooking, pointing out that we employed some of the finest chefs in New York and that she shouldn't feel obligated anymore. She accepted my reassurance with a polite smile, but my words only deepened the invisible wall between us, leaving her favorite gift without a rightful place in our fortified palace. The Bellini estate never truly slept, with heavy security vehicles rolling through the grounds and guards rotating posts beneath dim courtyard lights even long after midnight. Everyone within the compound had a strict, defined role, but Rose remained entirely excluded from the daily operational mechanics of the syndicate. One rainy Thursday just past 11 at night, that fragile, distant routine changed forever. Unable to sleep because of the restless atmosphere in the mansion, Rose wandered downstairs toward the service corridor and unexpectedly encountered 6 Bellini soldiers standing around. Their expensive suits were stained with mud from the field. One man's forearm was wrapped tightly in a hastily improvised bandage, and they looked completely exhausted from a dangerous operation that had only just concluded. When they opened the industrial refrigerator only to find wilted vegetables and a few cold containers of dry leftover pasta, Rose stepped forward from the shadows and offered to make something with whatever scraps were left in the pantry. Working quietly and efficiently in the midnight stillness, she transformed simple onions, garlic, leftover chicken, and homemade bread into a warm, deeply comforting meal. As the weary men ate, the oldest veteran shared that the food reminded him profoundly of his late wife, and Rose gently squeezed his hand in quiet, empathetic understanding. That single act of midnight hospitality sealed her fate within the organization, creating an unbreakable, hidden bond with the toughest men who protected the syndicate. The midnight kitchen gatherings did not remain a secret for long, expanding rapidly from 6 guards to 10, and eventually to nearly 20 hungry employees seeking solace. Drivers working 16-hour shifts, mechanics covered in engine grease, gardeners finishing before sunrise, and junior capos buried beneath endless responsibilities all began to drift toward the warm light of the service kitchen. Rose never prepared extravagant feasts, but she meticulously remembered individual preferences, adding extra pepper for Marco because old injuries dulled his taste, less salt for Anthony due to his blood pressure, and chocolate pudding on birthdays. One nervous young recruit apologized for taking a portion since he was only a recruit, but Rose simply handed him another slice of warm bread and told him he was simply someone who had experienced a long day. These small, deeply human gestures traveled through the Bellini organization faster than any rumor, treating rank as far less important than basic humanity. Meanwhile, external syndicate pressures collided with internal tensions. Vivian Morty, who had managed every household detail for 20 years, began noticing anomalies in the estate's kitchen inventory, realizing that bread consumption had doubled and fresh herbs were disappearing faster than ever. Believing that nothing should happen inside the Bellini estate without her direct knowledge, Vivian set out to uncover who was breaking her rules. The tightening web of Vivian's oversight threatened to expose the sanctuary Rose had quietly built, setting the stage for an inevitable collision between rigid institutional control and genuine human connection. The inevitable collision arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Vivian Morty followed a young pantry assistant carrying baskets of fresh bread straight to the forgotten service wing. Pushing open the heavy door, Vivian froze at the sight of nearly 30 people, drivers, mechanics, gardeners, bodyguards, and senior enforcers, sitting shoulder to shoulder around mismatched tables without any regard for rank or hierarchy. At the center stood Rose, her sleeves rolled up with a faint streak of flour on her cheek, serving homemade lasagna while listening to a soldier talk about his mother's surgery. When the room fell silent in sudden fear, Vivian stepped forward, her expression hardening as she demanded to know why the boss's residence had been turned into a servant's dining hall. Though a veteran tried to explain that they had asked Mrs. Bellini to cook, Vivian cut him off ruthlessly, telling Rose that a Bellini wife represents power and does not spend her evenings feeding guards. Rose answered softly that they were hungry, prompting Vivian to deliver a stinging final insult. Kindness without dignity becomes servitude. You are behaving like hired staff. The insult landed with calculated precision, stripping away Rose's support system and leaving her isolated in a hostile environment where her genuine warmth had been weaponized against her. She offered no defense or argument, simply nodding once to acknowledge the rigid rules of a world she could not change. The annual Bellini family anniversary banquet arrived just 3 days later, filling the grand ballroom with capos, business allies, politicians, and community leaders from across the region. Rose wore a simple deep blue gown, attempting to remain invisible after the painful confrontation with Vivian. Halfway through the evening, Vivian seized the opportunity to humiliate her further in front of the entire assembly, publicly announcing to the guests that Rose spent her evenings cooking for security guards and suggesting it was an inappropriate use of the Bellini name. A few uneasy chuckles echoed through the hall while Rose quietly lowered her fork, deeply saddened by how her genuine acts of kindness had been twisted into something people mocked. When she looked toward me, I expressed genuine confusion because she had never mentioned her cooking, and her simple response that I was too busy unsettled me more than I expected. Accepting Vivian's assertion that the estate must maintain its rigid standards, Rose offered no defense, no explanation, and no complaint. The following evening, the warm light beneath the little kitchen window remained completely dark. When the oldest capo knocked on her door to check, Rose quietly stated that she thought it best to stop, and though the men understood, the absence of her hospitality plunged the entire estate back into a cold, joyless efficiency. The cold, mechanical efficiency that returned to the Bellini estate after the kitchen closed quickly began to fracture the organization from the inside out. Drivers hurried through their shifts without conversation, guards stood at their posts in grim silence, and the atmosphere grew heavier than anyone could remember. Vincent noticed the profound change during a security briefing, observing that his chief of security and men like Marco answered every question with mechanical flatness instead of their usual friendly banter. Over the next several days, Vincent quietly investigated the shift, pulling employees aside one by one to uncover why the spirit of the compound had died. Through private conversations, he discovered how Rose had secretly cared for them, providing homemade soup for Marco after surgery, helping a young mechanic fix his daughter's bicycle, and baking sugar-free treats for an accountant with diabetes. Realizing that his wife had cultivated deep, genuine devotion through small acts of humanity, while he had relied entirely on fear and money, Vincent faced a stark realization. He had reached a critical turning point where he could either maintain the cold, intimidating status quo of his syndicate or choose to acknowledge the true soul of his household. Armed with this overwhelming truth just before the grand anniversary banquet, Vincent prepared to break the silence and face the rigid hierarchy he had spent his life enforcing. The annual Bellini family anniversary banquet glittered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers as politicians, capos, and community leaders filled the grand ballroom. As dessert was served, Vivian Morty rose elegantly to address the room, thanking everyone for preserving traditions and publicly nodding that Rose spent her evenings cooking for guards, framing it as an inappropriate use of the Bellini name. A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd while Rose lowered her eyes in quiet resignation. Instead of remaining silent as he always had, Vincent pushed his chair back, stood up, and commanded the attention of the entire room. Calmly and deliberately, he issued a single request to the assembly. Every person who had ever been cared for by his wife should stand. For a heartbeat, the ballroom was dead silent. Then Marco rose from his seat, followed immediately by the elderly veteran, mechanics, drivers, gardeners, housekeepers, kitchen assistants, and senior capos. Chair after chair slid backward across the floor in a rising tide until nearly the entire room stood in unanimous solidarity. Only Vivian remained seated, staring around in stunned disbelief. Covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes, Rose watched as Vincent walked across the floor and took her hand. Speaking loudly for the entire assembly to hear, Vincent confessed that he had been wrong to believe power alone held his empire together, openly declaring that Rose had accomplished what he never could by earning absolute loyalty without fear and giving their family a true home. The ballroom erupted into heartfelt applause, and voices from the back proudly echoed the title that captured their deepest respect. Mama Rose. In the weeks following the banquet, sweeping changes came naturally to the Bellini estate. Vivian Morty requested a private meeting with Rose, admitting quietly that she had judged her by appearances and mistakenly believed strength looked a certain way. Rose responded with complete grace, and within a month, Vivian stepped away from managing the estate to let younger staff members continue with greater openness. Vincent implemented profound changes of his own, transforming an unused wing of the mansion into a permanent family dining hall filled with long wooden tables, warm lighting, and an open kitchen where anyone from a new recruit to a senior capo could share a meal. Rose insisted the doors remain open to everyone, and Vincent supported her completely, recognizing that some decisions rightfully belonged to the true heart of the household. Several months later, a nervous young recruit entered the dining hall and watched battle-hardened veterans laughing over homemade bread while Rose and Vincent worked side by side. When the recruit asked why everyone smiled whenever Mrs. Bellini walked in, an older capo smiled and noted that while Boss Vincent built the strongest empire in America, Mrs. Bellini built the family that kept it standing. Overhearing every word, Vincent proudly wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders and stated loudly for everyone to hear, "And that's why every empire needs a queen." Surrounded by people who once shared nothing except fear, Rose looked out over a room now united by stories, meals, birthdays, and hope, proving that the greatest strength inside a mafia empire had never been intimidation, but the quiet, enduring love of the woman everyone once underestimated.